from the strain. Oh, I know you untied me. I'd be bound to you just the same. I can't breathe my heart from you, baby, 'cause you keep it hanging on your string. No, no, I can't breathe my heart from you, baby, 'cause you keep it hanging on your string. I can't breathe my heart from you, baby, 'cause you keep it hanging on your string. No, I can't breathe my heart from you, baby, 'cause you keep it hanging on your string.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the second day of the 8th Annual Virginia Housing Credit Conference. My name is Brian Koziel. I'm the Executive Director of the Virginia Housing Alliance and am incredibly pleased to have with us today Eric Johnston, the Director of the Department of Housing and Community Development, Pam Kessner, Chief Deputy, DHCD, and Willie Fobbs, Associate Director, Housing Preservation and Production, also at DHCD. Welcome all of y'all. Looking forward to spending the next hour and 15 minutes or so. And I know that you all have a presentation Pam is going to control, and I will just turn it over to you all.
Thank you so much, Brian. Really appreciate Virginia Housing Alliance, all that you do, Allison, your chair, and the whole board, and just glad to be on with all of the attendees of this conference. This is one of the premier housing events, and really is so critical to learning the latest and greatest on the tools and resources available to build that long-term pipeline of affordable housing that's so critical, and really as we're all working so hard on short-term pandemic-related responses to keep people stably housed in Virginia, how we cannot take our eyes off of the critical goal of increasing the supply of affordable housing, increasing the effort and working together across state, local, federal government, and nonprofit, private developers, the whole community of the development community that's involved with these projects, and our residents and communities that to drive these projects. So we're going to give a presentation today. I'm really glad to be joined by my colleagues Pam Kessner and Willie Fobbs, and I know that they're going to have some of the information that's even more interesting to the attendees today, talking through some of our resources available, like the Affordable Special Needs Housing program, the new Dollars in the Housing Trust Fund. I'm just going to start off, and next slide, Pam, by giving a couple high-level overviews. We've just been through the General Assembly session and then the special session, wrapping up with the final state budget. And so you can see we're going to give a couple updates on the Virginia Housing Trust Fund, the Virginia Rent and Mortgage Relief Program, the eviction prevention language that went through the General Assembly special session, and then a new diversion and pilot program that we're excited about to be long-term effort to create the systems to reduce evictions in Virginia. And Willie is going to provide an update on the Affordable and Special Needs Housing Program and some of the changes there, some of the funding availability. I do want to mention at the top of the agenda too, I know you heard from Susan Dewey yesterday and our great partners at Virginia Housing as well throughout this 2 days. we are also working together on House Bill 854 and that study to really take a comprehensive look at all of the housing needs across the Commonwealth and also the housing tools available to address those needs. There's a survey out right now that we'd really hope everyone participates in, and we're really focusing in on also including the pandemic impacts and also looking at equity and inclusion and making sure we address issues of equity in housing and take a pulse on providers and communities on where we're at in Virginia and where we need to go. It's a unique time. It's a unique focus right now, nationally and at the state level and local level on increasing the supply of affordable housing. And so I think all of us have to be stewards of that opportunity to really address what all of us have been working on for years in terms of trying to increase that supply and knock down barriers to help increase the supply. So we're hopefully have some time too for Q&A at the end and to get your feedback and thoughts, whether it be on this webinar or after. You'll have our contact information in the final slide if you don't have it already. Next slide, please. So just the big news I think for this conference is that the Virginia Housing Trust Fund was increased to 55 million. We really were sitting at a base budget of 7 million. Last year at the end of the special session, they increased it to 14 million. But in essence, our base budget was increased almost eightfold, Virginia Housing Alliance has been the key champion for the Virginia Housing Trust Fund since its inception. Many of you all were a part of that, and really what the General Assembly, even before the pandemic, the proposal was to go up to 30 million. And the biggest thing we get asked when the General Assembly members are looking at the requests like this, and the governor put this request in, was looking at the pipeline of projects and the results. And so with the work over the last several years that you all have shown results with the investments to the Housing Trust Fund, the General Assembly really has confidence in this program to provide both loans through the competitive loan pool and grants through our homeless reduction grant program to really solve many of the key issues in housing. So the 55 million, you can see the breakdown here. The General Assembly did with that increase of to go up to 55 million. They do set aside at least 12.5 million for the rent and mortgage relief program, and also ask us to reserve additional in case that the COVID relief funds from the CARES Act that we're currently using for that program, in case they run out, so that the funds are still there to help landlords and tenants during the emergency here. And as all of you are likely very aware of, we're waiting on when the additional federal relief will come. The COVID relief funds have an expiration date of December 30th of this year. So there's a bit of uncertainty right now about when the next state and local relief will come, if it will come from Congress, and then also into next year what rent relief will look like. So we have several months where we basically are using the CRF, the COVID relief funds, and then also have some additional funds available through the Housing Trust Fund and Community Development Block Grants to bridge to a time where hopefully there'll be some more federal relief for that emergency response program. But we do have 16,680,000 reserved for the competitive loan pool, and Willie's going to go into much more depth about that, which is just one component of the affordable and special needs housing pool, but it's a significant bump to allow us to fund more projects and to focus in on incentivizing permanent supportive housing and some of the state policy goals and local goals to serve the most vulnerable. Next slide. So before I turn it to Willie to go into more depth on the Housing Trust Fund, I did just want to say that a couple things. One, we're just really, again, appreciative of the efforts together on the Virginia Housing Trust Fund, and that the pipeline of projects is going to be critical. I know there's so many challenges for those developing these projects in these times with increased costs, increased supply costs, increased labor, increased uncertainty. But we definitely want to work together to ensure that we continue to make the case for the challenges that the development community is undergoing as we try to increase the supply of affordable housing during a pandemic, but also as we try to do it long term. So thanks for having us here, and look forward to the conversation. This time I'll turn it over to Willie Fobbs.
Great, thanks, Eric. And I want to thank you all for having us here this morning. We're excited about, as Eric mentioned, about the direction that things in the affordable housing arena are headed, and we just I'm just personally happy to and proud to be a part of it. Eric talked generally about the allocation of the trust fund. I think for those of you who are kind of new to this, the Virginia Housing Trust Fund was created originally, I think, in 2012, and through a budget bill in a special session, that's the time that the structure was created, and it established language which outlined the basic parameters for the trust fund. The parameters included guidance on the allocation of funds for grants, loans, and a statement describing the types of activities that are eligible. The original funding for the trust fund was originally awarded in the 2013-2014 biennium, but the way it was structured at the time was the base amount was $7 million. It was all shoved into the second year of the biennium, and that was contingent upon actual revenues. And so that will give you a sense of how far the trust fund and the acknowledgement of the trust fund has come since that 2012-2013 window. As Eric mentioned, the final 2020 number approved was the 55 million, which was a historic increase, which significantly increased the amount of money available for affordable housing, and also for homeless reduction grants. And so again, for those of you that are kind of new, one of the things that I like to make sure that folks understand, that the statutory language that created the trust fund is fairly prescriptive. The language identifies that no less than 80% of the funding has to be used to provide loans to underwrite and reduce the cost of affordable housing and home ownership, and up to 20% of the funds can be targeted towards grants for targeted efforts to reduce homelessness. In the 2020 session, there was some specific budget language that was added, given the impacts of COVID and a number of things that were going on at the time, that allowed that breakdown to be shifted. And so that's what's reflected in the chart you saw on the previous slide. And certainly if you have any questions about that, we can answer that. But the budget language shifted that adjustment to 60% towards loans and 40% up to grants, and that type of activity focused on targeting homelessness or reducing homelessness. While the competitive loan pool will accommodate an array of possible projects, it's primarily intended to acknowledge the direction of a number of gubernatorial and General Assembly level initiatives, as well as giving priorities to demonstration projects that address articulated state housing policies. Such policies include supporting affordable community housing options for persons with disabilities, including housing for people with serious mental illness, and funding that could aid in the state's response to the U.S. Department of Justice settlement, and expanding permanent housing opportunities for persons experiencing homelessness. So what you see there, the slide that's up right now, the focus has been on trying to bridge the work and impact of a number of different organizations, all focused on providing affordable housing efforts to targeted special needs communities throughout the state. Over the past several years, DHCD has partnered with VHDA and Virginia Housing, excuse me, and other state agencies within Health and Human Resources Secretariat, including the Department of Behavioral Health Services, Department of Medical Assistance Services, Department of Aging, Department of Health and Social Services and Veteran Services, to coordinate our efforts and leverage resources to increase housing options for people with serious mental illness, people with intellectual and other developmental disabilities, and people who are chronically homeless. These efforts focus primarily on the development of additional permanent supportive housing units, which I want to talk a little bit about before we get into the broader affordable and special needs housing program. The trust fund has been used to construct new or rehab existing housing in support of that policy initiative of increasing PSH units. In addition, and I'll talk a little bit about this towards the end, but the trust fund also provides for pre-development activities of permanent supportive housing units and to provide supportive services for those experiencing homelessness. Next slide, Pam. Permanent supportive housing is a statewide initiative to direct and connect individuals meeting the PSH criteria with affordable housing. There are a number of guiding entities such as the Interagency Leadership Team that is comprised of the heads of a number of state agencies and focused on advising efforts and creating and addressing PSH units across the state. As such, projects which are selecting to reserve a set aside of PSH units must exhibit a direct service and referral connection with referring and or service agency as demonstrated by an MOU or MOA or something of that nature. One of the things that we have, and I'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about specifically the Affordable Special Needs Housing Program, is that we have adjusted our guidelines to try and also incentivize the work that's being done by the PSH Steering Committee, as well as the ILT, Interagency Leadership Team, and their activities. One of the key things, I guess, just to point out, is that units who receive preferences under our scoring and award process, they have to ensure that if there are vacancies or when vacancies become available for those properties, that they have to be coordinated and remain open for a minimum of at least 60 days. We requested they be listed on Virginia Housing Search for as units designated for having a PSH preference. And then, you know, we work with the developers if you aren't able to fill targeted units within that time to you know, get those units back in service. And then we kind of work on a floating basis with developers. So next slide, Pam. I'm sorry, I think I may have included that in you can go to the next one, Pam. So I want to talk specifically about the Affordable and Special Needs Housing Program. I know a number of you all who are viewing this are familiar with the program. I know that there has been an expansion in developers over the last couple of years. We've had quite a few inquiries of folks who are new to developing in Virginia. And we've had a number of questions, so we want to make sure that we give you a good outline of what the program is intended to do and kind of the process that's associated with it. The Affordable and Special Needs Housing Program combines multiple funding sources into a single application to allow projects to submit for their own strategic funding needs, and then DHCD evaluates that funding request to identify the most appropriate sources of funds to meet the project's long-term financing needs. The three main sources, you can go ahead and switch to the next slide, Pam. The three main sources of the Affordable and Special Needs Housing Program, as I've outlined, are the Virginia Housing Trust Fund, which, as Eric mentioned, we have just over $16 million allocated in this year, which is the largest allocation of funds for this program that we've seen since its inception. The HOME program, which is the largest federal block grant to states and local governments designed exclusively to create affordable housing for low-income households, is included as part of DHCD's Affordable Special Needs Housing Part. Home funds are awarded annually as formula grants to participating jurisdictions or states and localities. And the program's flexibility allows states and local governments to use home funds for grants, direct loans, loan guarantees, and other form of credit enhancement or rental assistance or security deposits. In Virginia, at the state level, we have chosen to, as I mentioned, roll that source of funding into our Affordable Special Needs Housing program, and of which all of the funds that are home funds that are awarded out for on the rental side are in the form of loans. And I'll talk a little bit more about how they're structured here in Virginia. For those pursuing home ownership projects, we have those as a 0% interest loan, which effectively makes it a grant. And the idea there is we can help developers target the deepest of incomes when it comes to the home ownership side. The National Housing Trust Fund is the first new federal housing resource since 1974, targeted at building, rehabilitating, and preserving and operating rental housing for extremely low income folks. The National Housing Trust Fund was created through the passage of the Housing and Economic Recovery Act of 2008. And the first allocation of the National Housing Trust Fund occurred in 2016. And that first allocation was at $174 million. And that's nationwide. And they were allocated to states. In 2017, that number rose to 219 million. In 2018, that number rose to 267 million. And I'm pleased to say here in 2020, that number has grown to 326 million nationwide. So that reflects a couple of things. I think that at the federal level, an acknowledgement of the growing housing crisis, and the revenues that were generated as a result of the Housing and Recovery Act have been targeted to get out to states to address and assist the neediest of renters around the country. Now, the one thing I did mention about the National Trust Fund, I think it's key to remind or remember as we kind of talk through this, is that those funds are focused on extremely low income. So that means that if your property or your project is targeting units at 30% or below AMI, that's where that source comes in as a benefit to the project. The last source that's identified on the chart there, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it. There's part of DHCD's base budget that's carved out, and it allocates a small amount of state money through the agency's block award appropriation of $500,000, and we include that as part of the award when we make funding decisions through the broader Affordable Special Needs Housing Program. Next slide, Pam. So this slide right here, I know this, you always get the lessons when you do PowerPoints, to not try to put too much information on there, but it's critical just to kind of give you a sense of how the funding is broken down. Again, it's a single program as far as we're concerned, as far as you would be concerned, a single application, but there's individual funding sources in there that all carry their own little bit of nuances, and we try to do our best when we review applications and make awards to bridge those, to make them seamless to applicants. The key things to take away from this slide, there are project limits, and so the amount of funding that you can apply for out of any given individual source is a maximum of $700,000, or if you have targeted permanent supportive housing units, which again, as I mentioned, supports that broader state policy effort, we will allow you to apply for up to $900,000 in any one given, of the three main sources, any one given source. There are no restrictions. All of these funds are eligible to be used statewide. The only thing that I'll point out is that for the HOME program, if you recall me mentioning that program goes to both states and localities, If you have a project that is located in a locality that also receives home funds, we would require that there be some sort of a matching contribution through the locality. Now, I want to be clear, that matching contribution, and it's 25% of any amount that's requested through DHCD's program, but that does not have to be local home funds or CDBG. It can be any locally controlled resource. So we allow some flexibility there. And one of the things we do is we allow developers to work with the locality to determine what the capacity of that locality is to be engaged in the project. Another big piece of this is we want to ensure that there's communication within the local jurisdiction about your project, and that there's local buy-in. I'll note, because I still get questions of, well, how come DHCD does that? There's a reality about certain resources to deal with affordable housing, and there's some localities that might get home funds. There's other localities that don't, that aren't able to qualify for a home block grant. And so we would often get questions about, well, if the state's getting money and then a locality that also gets home funds, they're getting money, then why would the state allow its resources to go into that community? And so we try to remind folks that we're a statewide organization. So we try to address affordable housing efforts statewide, but one of the ways that we've tried to make sure that we offset, I think, some of that opposition to investing in both entitlement and non-entitlement jurisdictions is that we want there to be some local contribution to the projects. And the other key area to focus on, I guess, is where we talk about the income targeting. You'll see under the trust fund, statutorily, it's established at 80% or below AMI, and that's across the board. For the home program, if home funds are invested in rental housing, they are capped at projects that are serving, or units that are serving folks at 60% AMI. But if they're used in home ownership projects, they can also go up to 80% AMI. And then, as I mentioned, for the National Trust Fund, those are for extremely low income targeting. So that's at 30% AMI. Next slide, Pam. Okay, so in relationship to the previous slide, one of the things that we've had a lot of feedback on in this current program evaluation year was, the fact that folks have been, and especially given COVID impacts and some construction delays and the cost of rising materials, we've had folks say, well, perhaps you should consider raising the limits for those individual project caps, and specifically on the Housing Trust Fund has been, I think, one of the biggest requests that we received, and that's primarily because it's the most flexible of all the resources. But one of the things that I would like to stress here is that we will evaluate your project based on the need. Now, one of the key things for our program design is that these funds are targeted at projects that are a minimum of 5 units. So if you have a duplex or quadplex, this particular resource won't fit for acquisition or rehab or new construction of that type of housing. But if you get into in both the state and federal definitions of multifamilies, 5 units or more, then this is a resource that you can access. And so you can see there that we're talking about, 100, 200 units in certain parts of the state, and you're talking about, 12, 15 unit complexes in other parts of the state. And as I also mentioned, home ownership for at least the home and the Virginia Housing Trust Fund side are in fact also eligible. It would just, again, be that if you're preparing for home ownership development, that we'd want to see at least an investment of 5 units to kind of make that cost effective. The other key things I want to mention about the way we evaluate projects. So if you apply for affordable special needs housing resources and you're, let's say you have a project, you don't have any units targeting 30% AMI, but you need assistance through the program. The way we have structured it, your project would be eligible to receive up to $1.4 million in an award through the Affordable Special Needs Housing Project. If you include some units that are targeted at 30% or below AMI, and you're just basically bringing in vouchers to support that, then that would qualify you to also receive an allocation of National Housing Trust funds. And so in that scenario, your project would be eligible for assistance of up to $2 million total through all three funding sources for the project. And so if your project then not only meets the home and trust fund, and you're also targeting 30% AMI units, but you've also identified a partnership with a service agency or an agency that provides supportive housing services and coordination, then that would allow your project to apply for a total of up to $2.4 million across all of the funding sources that I've outlined. So one of the ways we've tried to do is, we've tried to be realistic. We know that there's a state policy initiative to focus in on creating additional PSH units. We've tried to structure our program to incentivize that, but we also know that, communities have different needs. And so our objective is to be responsive to what your community or your development activity needs to accomplish to serve your community. So wanted to make sure that, and the other thing I will mention is that I did put this as a bullet in the bottom, knowing that we've had a number of applicants who may have been awarded in previous rounds, again, due to COVID impacts, increasing costs and some other things, that those folks have considered or contacted us about coming back in for additional funding. These new program caps apply. So if you applied previously, and we've made some slight increases this year, so if you applied previously and met those program caps, you could come back in for additional funds. But I want to be sure that you understand that any new awards would include and be calculated also including previous awards through the Affordable Special Needs Housing Program. Next slide, please. All right, the general structure for how the Affordable Special Needs Housing Program is structured. As I mentioned, with the Virginia Housing Trust Fund, the statutory language requires that money be provided in the form of a loan. The home funds and the National Trust Fund gives us a little bit more flexibility in how we structure those. But again, our objective when we look at the project is to evaluate what are the needs of the project, and then we talk about the funding sources or the funding that's offered to the project and how we are able to structure that. But all of the loans issued through the Affordable Special Needs Housing Program are in fact deferred principal loans. So whether it's a $700,000 award, $2.4 million award, the principal amount awarded under our program is in fact deferred. So during the term of the affordability and compliance period, there is no repayment requirement of the principal. Our stated program guidelines are that all of our loans are made at a 3% interest only. And this is in fact must pay debt. And that's a question I get often about, we refer to it as gap financing, but can it be, cash flow only, these other types of structures? The program is set up, it is in fact an interest only must pay debt program. Now, what we will do is we will negotiate that interest rate based on the needs of the project. And so that's one of the things we want to ensure, that there's flexibility for us to sit down at a table, talk about, what the long-term impacts are of the other funding sources in the project and how we can structure our funds to be complementary for those and not give a negative impact to the program, to the project. Interest-only payments are throughout the compliance term. And so if you have a 20 or 30-year compliance period, the interest-only payments would be for that window. At the conclusion of your compliance period, there are a number of options that are available to how we would structure the funding. There can be a balloon payment at the end. And that's probably the most, I guess, common structure that folks ask for. Whoop, I lost my presentation there. That's the most common structure that folks ask for. Then another option is that the funding can be structured with a forgiveness component. With that being the case, and I know for those of you who are tax credit field, that can be that can cause some stickiness with some of your investors and how that's structured. So, we identified that is an option, but we will negotiate that with you and your tax credit syndicated to be most effective for the project and not create an undue burden. And then there's always the option of a refinance at the end of the compliance period, and understanding that a fair portion of our funding also goes into the broader financing package that we will allow you to just refinance out at the end. The other thing I wanted to talk about, a couple of things, and thanks, Brian. Next slide. Eligible applicants. One of the questions that I often receive are, is this program only for nonprofit developers? And the answer there is no. We, in fact, the project's open for both for-profit and nonprofit developers. Units of local government are eligible applicants for this program and these resources. We just have a handful of guidelines that the applicant must be either project owner, developer or sponsor of the project. They can be and should more than likely be the primary partner in the project. They must be the entity that's responsible or has an arm in being responsible for the long-term operations and compliance of the project. And we have a general guideline within DHCD, and this is really more driven by state compliance, that they must be free of any audit or outstanding compliance issues. One of the questions that I often get is that the LLC entity, and I know, under the structure, they are usually created to develop the project. The LLC entity cannot be the applicant. So it would have to be one of the primary partners in the LLC for these funds. And then state certified CHODOs. Some of you all are familiar with what a community housing development organization is. That is a specific HUD designation for the home program. And the reason why I bring that up is we've made a couple of adjustments this year, given the fact that, we know that a number of our smaller nonprofit partners have been impacted by COVID-related issues. So we have reinstituted the opportunity for organizations to apply for operating assistance, but that operating assistance would only be available, because it's funded through the home program, would only be available to entities who have been designated as CHODOs, or community housing development organizations. Next slide, Brian. As I mentioned, there's a couple of things that I wanted to point out that are new for 2020, 2021. The first I've already mentioned, DHCD has set aside a carve out of $200,000 to assist CHODOs with operating assistance. And so the key thing to remember about that, your ability to go out to the operating assistance, is that operating assistance has to be tied to a potential CHODO operating or a CHODO eligible project. So what that means is you would have to meet the organizational certification requirements. And I can share with you what those are if you want to reach out to me after the presentation. This structure typically fits better with small community-based organizations, but there's nothing to say a larger organization who is a nonprofit and board-driven couldn't qualify as a CHODO. But the other piece of this is that we make an assessment on the operating needs of that organization to see the project through to fruition, to get you in a position where that project would be eligible to apply for a CHODO set aside after the I guess pre-development type activity has occurred. The second thing I wanted to point out is that, and this is not necessarily new, but it's been shifted over to the Affordable Special Needs Housing Program, is that DHCD has increased the amount of money that's as part of that 20%, now 40% grant portion that I mentioned with the State Trust Fund, to incentivize and provide assistance for pre-development grants that are specifically targeted at creating additional PSH units. So the general structure of the program is that projects are eligible to receive up to $100,000 in pre-development, in the form of a pre-development grant. It's for generally and typically recognized pre-development activities like site control, engineering studies, architectural design, those types of things. I mentioned that it's not new. We've traditionally, that has been tied in with our homeless reduction activity that occurs through the state trust fund, but we've shifted that over to our affordable and special needs side of the house because we know that typically folks who are in attendance at this type of a conference and generally on the development side are the entities that would be more inclined to take advantage of these opportunities. And again, what we're trying to do with this set aside and by increasing it a little bit is to again incentivize and support what we identified earlier as a state housing initiative through the administration. Next slide. Just a couple of quick things in closing about the Affordable Special Needs Housing Program. So when we were planning the conference and I knew I'd be presenting, one of the things that had already happened is that I knew we would be coming right up on a deadline. So my guess is if you're hearing this for the first time and it sounds interesting, March is probably going to be more attractive to you, but we have 2 application deadlines. Now, traditionally, we run 2 funding cycles annually. We do one in the spring, which would typically be that March application deadline. We do one in the fall, which is usually in October. So we got pushed back this year because of all of the activity associated with the special session. And while we were waiting to solidify the resources that were going to be available for us to award. So we actually are coming up on an application deadline, which is Friday. And just, a quick glance of applications that have already been submitted. I think we, on average, we probably receive anywhere from 20 to 25 applications per cycle. At last check, last night before I went to bed, we were up to 42 just in the current round. So we know we have our work cut out for us. Our objective is to get those things reviewed, scored, and feedback as quickly as possible. So that Herculean task is ahead of us. One of the things I wanted to also stress about the program is all of the projects are individually reviewed and scored, and we have a panel of folks internally who look at those applications individually as well as doing it as a group. And so the key areas that we look at when we evaluate applications, I just wanted to kind of stress this, are we look at the need for the project, what we call project feasibility / readiness, and then developer capacity. So those are the main areas that we look at, and I'll cover just a little bit of what's involved in that and what we typically try to look for. But you'll see there that all projects have to score a minimum of 60 points to be considered for funding under the Affordable Special Needs Housing Program. Next slide. So before I turn it over, I'll just talk real quick about those 3 categories. So under the need side, we look at market studies or needs assessments that support the need for the project. We look at things like low vacancy rates in similar projects. Obviously one of the key components is we don't want to see that, that there's 5 projects in the construction and they're all, or finished construction and they're all like 50% complete. I mean, that doesn't necessarily express a need for a community. And we know in broad sense there's a shortage of affordable housing throughout the Commonwealth and really throughout the country. But we have to, again, in making assessments on individual projects, we do look at local vacancy rates and things like that of similar type projects. There's has to be a match between the project unit numbers and the type of projects that are demonstrating the need. So, if it's a predominantly, millennial community and all of the apartments proposed, the 3-bedroom apartments, that match doesn't work there. So that's a conversation we would have with an applicant. Local government service provider support, again, focused on unit shortages or demands. In the case of home ownership, we want to see that there's a pipeline of qualified buyers that have been identified as potential owners of those homes. Does the project meet any of the priority needs? As I mentioned, permanent supportive housing is a state priority, universal design, and things like that. And performance of I guess non-entitlement projects. And so that's just comparing whether it's trust fund versus home funds. As I mentioned, we have state funds, we have federal funds. The federal funds come with a few more strings. So we need to ensure that if we evaluate a project, that for long-term compliance, that we can continue to report to our federal partners and funders that our projects are able to continue the compliance and meet those requirements. On the project feasibility, we look at things like, are there other funding sources committed, and what are the status of those? If we could fund the whole project, we would. We know we're talking about a limited resource. As Eric mentioned, when we started out, we started with $7 million over, a biennium, and now we're fortunate enough to have an influx of funding like we do right now. But it's still not enough to meet the need, and we know that. So one of the things we want to look at is project readiness. Are the main sources of funding? If it's a LIHTC project, what are the status of the LIHTC credit awards, those types of things? If there's a permanent financing first mortgage, is that in place? Is there agreement? That type of thing. We look at cost estimates. We know that the numbers have been changing quite a bit over the last 8 to 10 months. So that's a key thing that we review when we look at a project. Is it the appropriate design? Is it located near jobs, schools, transportation? And obviously that's going to be focused on, the type of project that you're proposing, but these are things that we look at in terms of project feasibility. And are the operational costs reasonable to meet cash flow and expense requirements? And then lastly, I guess if we also look at, are there any logistical impediments, local zoning and those types of things. And then the last thing I'll focus on and talk about is development team capacity. That's a key factor. And we take a look at that when we evaluate projects. What is the development team's experience with similar projects and delivering those projects on time? And then we look at the financial soundness of the key partners to the development entity or partnership. And then also, and lastly, the property management component. So are we talking about an experienced property manager? Are we talking about, a situation where this may be a first time partnership? So those are kind of I guess a layout of the areas that we look at. And I'm going to turn it over, although I don't know that Pam is back on the line yet. So Eric, I don't know if you want to take this over, but and we'll have an opportunity for some questions and answers at the end. Thank you.
So I'm back, Willie. Thank you.
Okay.
This is Pam Kessner, Chief Deputy at DHCD. My apologies. Of course, I would lose internet connectivities and while I was in control of the slide deck. So I apologize for the interruption. Really happy to be here with you all. Eric and Willie are always hard acts to follow. Before I jump into the rent and mortgage relief program, I did just want to mention, as it relates to the Housing Trust Fund, Willie mentioned the homeless reduction grant. Though there is an RFP on the street now, you can find it on our website. The deadline for applications for the homeless reduction grant is December 7th, so it's right around the corner. A couple of things to note. For the first time, there are a couple of pilot opportunities, one that's focused on addressing youth homelessness and another to addressing older adults who are experiencing homelessness. So take a look at that, and we're excited about reviewing applications during the month of December, just like Willie and his team. So Virginia Rent and Mortgage Relief Program. I'm sure many of you have heard about this program. I hope if you haven't, really pleased to share the background of the program, where we are and where we're going. So this program was initially launched back in June at the request of the governor, recognizing that The moratorium within the state Supreme Court had issued a moratorium for a period of time. It was about to be lifted. The governor was able to work with the Chief Justice to have it extended while giving DHCD time to stand up within a 3-week period of time, a statewide rent and mortgage relief program. And the specific reason this program was created was to ensure that people stay housed during a pandemic. So the COVID relief funds that we're currently utilizing through the U.S. Department of Treasury that expire on December 30th are being used to make landlords and mortgage companies whole while keeping people housed, but also to stabilize the housing market. We know that the rental market and the mortgage markets are key to our economic stability, and not to mention key to keeping people, households housed during a pandemic. Next slide, Brian. We initially kicked off the program with having 31 grantees statewide in communities to administer the program with tenants taking the lead in making application. Landlords have to be part of the process to agree to receive the funds. The funds are made directly to the landlord or to the mortgage servicer. But it didn't take long into the summer months that we recognized that the huge need for this program was overwhelming our grantees across the state. That is no reflection on those grantees whatsoever. It's just that the impact that households were having related to being able to pay for their rent or mortgage was impacted when employers had to downsize or reduce hours. So we then in September worked closely with Virginia Housing to launch a landlord approach. So then we had an additional door, if you will, for landlords to work directly with Virginia Housing. This was particularly helpful for landlords that have multiple units. The landlord could go through, work with their tenants and use their they had to submit or still have to submit one profile, but can apply for multiple tenants. We are currently transitioning the tenant and homeowner approach. I mentioned 31 grantees. We're now transitioning in the month of December to a support center. But there's no break in service. Applicants can continue to apply and you can get more information. Well, I've got, I think our website address is later in the PowerPoint. But we currently are providing 100% of current month's rent and then 100% of past due mortgage or rent starting April 1st to present. Next slide, Brian. With the initially the governor provided $50 million and then a month or so ago expanded that amount to $62 million. So again, this is COVID relief money that expires December 30th. We had hoped that perhaps that expiration date that was developed at the federal level would be extended, but to date it is still December 30th. So DHCD worked with the governor's office and with the General Assembly, as Eric mentioned, through the special session. The Virginia Housing Trust Fund now has at least $12.5 million up to $25 million to put towards the rent and mortgage relief program once the COVID relief funds, the $62 million has been obligated. Starting in January, we will be utilizing community development block grant funds through the CARES Act. Up to 30 million has been allocated for this activity. There are some different criteria that we have to abide by because it is CDBG funding. Our teams are working now to get clarification from HUD as it relates to utilizing CDBG for rent and mortgage relief. There are additional constraints. We're going to continue with the eligibility, which is 80%, up to 80% AMI, a household, and that is current income. That's not based on last year's tax return, since this is focused on the impact that COVID has had on income. It's current income. Also, the rent and mortgage payments have to fall at or below 150% of the fair market rent. And the household has to demonstrate that the reason that they're not able to pay their rent or mortgage is based on COVID reasons. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. I was thinking this was an earlier slide. So this just outlines again the criteria. One thing I didn't mention is about having a valid lease or mortgage statement in the name of the person applying for the relief. It can also be, if you don't have a lease, you can have some other form of documentation confirming the landlord-tenant relationship. Next slide. To give you an idea of the huge need and impact that this program has had so far, between June 29th, when the program was launched, and our most recent reports from our grantees, which was through November 18th, more than 18,770 households have applied, received, or in process applications. Of that number, 10,813 households have had their rent paid, equaling to about $31.8 million in payments. Mortgage payments for households, we assisted 390, equaling more than $1.8 million in mortgage payments. And just a point, it's good to know we're reaching families in need. It's disturbing that we have so many families in need, but we're pleased that these resources have been able to assist those with children. Over 13,000 children have been impacted by these funds, and of that number, over 7,000 have been under the age of 9. Next slide. Here are some links and how to access the program for landlords. We accessing the program through Virginia Housing, and that's a link. So if this PowerPoint is made available, that should take you directly there. For tenants and homeowners, we're partnered with 211 Virginia, who can assist in directing tenants and homeowners to the appropriate place during this transition. New applicants will be directed to the support center, and returning applicants wanting a status update will be referred to the original grantee. Other helpful websites here: Stay Home Virginia, really great website that Virginia Housing has developed in partnership with DHCD that lists all sorts of resources, rent mortgage relief being one of them. We also have information on our website, as well as a communications guide. As we transition into the next iteration of RMRP, which we fondly refer to as RMRP 2.0, come January, we'll be updating many of those resources. And as it relates to those resources, we provide information in Spanish, but we're also working to provide those resources and information in additional languages. That's one of the areas of feedback we've received, that we need to broaden that scope. And so we will be working to get that done between now and January. Next slide. So as it relates to eviction prevention, Eric mentioned that Governor Northam and the General Assembly approved during the special session the Eviction Prevention and Diversion Pilot Program. We're really excited about this. This was something that was already on our radar pre-pandemic. As many of you know, I'm sure that Virginia was called out of having 5 of the 10 communities with the highest eviction rates in the nation a couple of years ago, and that got everyone's attention. So we've been working closely with stakeholders, governor's office, our legislators, to identify, so what's going on in our state and in some specific communities as to why eviction rates are so high. So a pilot program has been approved. While it's called the Eviction Prevention and Diversion Pilot Program, we're probably going to change that name because it's similar to others in the state. And we're going to focus much of this work on prevention. We know that once a household is issued an unlawful detainer and touches the court system, they're already deeply in debt. They also now have something on their record that is difficult to remove and becomes an obstacle for future access to affordable, safe housing. So this pilot will be focused on looking at what types of systems need to be in place at the community level to ensure households get connected to resources before they get into dire straits with their landlords and being able to pay their rent. While this is primarily focused on financial assistance, we know that some households get evicted for other reasons. So we also will be working with the pilot communities in identifying how to address other issues related to evictions. The General Assembly and the governor has approved 3.3 million. Of that, 3 million will be issued through a competitive grant process, looking to fund up to 7 pilot sites. We're going to give priority to those communities that have high eviction rates, and those high eviction rates are pre-pandemic. At the moment, many communities are faced with high eviction rates because of the COVID-19 pandemic. The request for proposals will be issued December 4th. Deadline will be January 8th. And we will be hosting a mandatory how to apply webinar. We're making it mandatory because there's some specific things that applicants, we really want folks to incorporate into their proposals. And we're going to provide 2 options to attend the webinar, December 9th and 17th. That information, the times and links will be in the request for proposals. One thing that I also wanted to mention that DHCD is committed to addressing the issue of racial inequities in housing. And as we incorporate and develop new programs and projects like the Rent and Mortgage Relief Program, like the Eviction Prevention Pilot, we particularly are wanting to ensure that communities of color, households of color, have access to these resources. We know that eviction occurs more with communities of color. We are requiring pilot sites to have households that have lived experience, lived expertise to be involved in the pilot so that their experience and knowledge and feedback can be incorporated into the design. Next. So those are the programs. I did want to make quick mention of, as it relates to evictions, that as a result of the General Assembly's special session, there is new legislation that specifically focuses on the preventing evictions now, as well as going into 2021. It is a link to that legislation, and details about it can be found at the Stay Home Virginia website that we shared earlier in the slides, but did want to bring your attention to that. Currently, we are operating under an eviction moratorium through the Centers for Disease Control, but also the legislature and the governor saw fit that we needed additional protections to allow more time so that we can make landlords and tenants whole and keep people housed as this pandemic continues into 2021.
Thank you all so much. I know that we've got, in honestly perfect timing, we've got a few questions in the Q&A, and so we'll probably, what we'll do, I think, is just run through the Q&A answers and then move to the chat and see if we can get to those, if that works for you all. So the one question, are the funds for PSH for any project that is partially PSH integrated, or are they for PSH only? I think that.
I'll take that. It would be PSH integrated. So it would not be, there's no, restriction requirement. Quite frankly, we know that, how difficult it would be to have a majority of your units, PSH units. But basically what we do is we evaluate projects, and it's typically going to be incorporating PSH units. And then that's how we would kind of make, the determination on the appropriate amounts of investment and that type of thing.
Okay, thank you. And so then a couple questions, Pam, around RMRP. And it looks like anecdotal reports claim that the tenant approach is woefully backlogged and that the service provider often doesn't get back to people trying to apply via telephone. Is this why it's transferring to a support center? And then on top of that, are RMRP awards denied for tenants who carried a balance prior to April 1? And so I'll let you answer that. But I also think, during your presentation, I was thinking about how just the logistics of standing up a program such as RMRP, and the date, I kind of had forgotten when it began, but it was back in June. And particularly since there's no existing kind of infrastructure between the state and individuals that are requesting resources, or even really with landlords. And I just think that it's really important to kind of, at least for me to acknowledge that you all have been faced with a really, really incredibly challenging task to get all of this money out to people is not is not an easy thing to do. But I'll let you go back to those questions.
Yeah, thank you, Brian, and thank you for that acknowledgement. I just want to use that as an opportunity, number one, to give a huge shout out and thank you to our grantee partners across the state. They stepped up in short order to be responsive to the needs of households, to the needs of landlords. And while it was very slow uptake because we were really designing and tweaking things as we went, things started rolling along. And yes, indeed, there is a backlog. And we continue to tweak the program to try to address the backlog. And I won't go into all the different changes that we made, but we made multiple changes. The support center is a strategy that we incorporated to try to address this backlog. And while it's going to take some time to get through it, we need people to be patient with us as we do this transition. Applications will be processed. We are, that's why we wanted to tee up different funding streams, knowing that the COVID relief funds were going to expire the end of December or December 30th. We have the Housing Trust Fund and then CDBG, but we're hopeful that Congress will be providing additional funds for RMRP because the need is much greater than what we currently have, in funding resources. So yes, indeed, the support center is that approach that we're hoping to streamline and to better serve applicants. So for example, for tenants and homeowners, the application will be online, and it's one application regardless of where you live. It'll look the same, the process will be the same, but there'll be backup assistance through the support center if tenants have a difficult time completing the application. We do want to encourage tenants to reach out to landlords to state that there's also the other door, Virginia Housing, that the landlord can take the initiative, but we'll still need to work with the tenant in applying for those funds. Was that both questions? I know it was a two-parter or two questions.
Yeah, no, I think that answers them sufficiently. And then, so back in the chat, there are a couple of questions. Is there a per development limit on the $500,000 available for PSH? And then also, will the PSH funds also be structured as a deferred principal loan?
Okay, so that's a good question. So the short answer is no. As I mentioned, we have it's a small direct allocation. We like to obviously make folks aware of it, but what we have traditionally done with that smaller allocation is look to plug a gap in probably the neediest of the PSH structures that we've seen. So we will actually work with you if necessary to plug that as a complete grant. So that's kind of, I'll just kind of put that out there. I mean, obviously it's not a whole lot of money, but what we try to do is to make sure that we serve the neediest of projects. So it would be structured, it can be structured as a grant, and most often, quite frankly, has been. And that we just secure that with the lien, and it just runs with the length of the affordability period. The second part of that question, there is no program gap or project gap. It's a small portion, and you can apply for that entire amount. So there's, it's such a small amount of money. We haven't been able to determine that we can make an impact by trying to break that up. So what we have done is, again, we've tried to incentivize the PSH activity through the other funding sources, because obviously we have more funding there, and that's where we'll allow the additional caps for individual projects which has PSH units. But of that money reference there, no, it can be just the full source to a single project, and it can be structured as a grant.
Great, thank you, Willie. And then from another question about the ASNH funds. Have you considered having a part of the ASNH funds that are more opportunistic and not on a competitive funding schedule? 2 rounds are helpful. Any thoughts?
So I will say this. I think there will be ample opportunity to perhaps propose something like that. We again, everything's a little bit behind schedule now. We're going to be engaging in public input sessions. I don't have the new schedule. My guess is it will be in early spring. But I think that it's an opportunity to explore that now. I think you know, part of it is going to depend on whether the investments and appropriations stay at the, you know, at the kind of levels that there are right now. There may be that potential for you know, a carve out or something to be you know, I guess more influential in kind of directing a project as opposed to just kind of, you know, in the back end filling gaps. But and Eric, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but I think that's a you know, I'll just mention, I think that I've heard a few more comments or requests like that.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is that the second year of the biennium does have 30 million still in it. So we've got 55 million for this fiscal year that we're currently in. And then starting next July, the current base budget has 30 million, which is great news. And then, you know, the General Assembly will solidify, and the governor's budget solidify that next General Assembly session at the beginning of 2021. But we definitely want to stay open to ideas as we move from having a trust fund you know, at the levels it was before to hopefully being a much larger sum of money. And so just want to keep hearing good ideas and no commitments on that, but thanks for the suggestion.
Great, thank you. And then Pam, so just to circle back, there was a question about prior balance of 4-1 would be denied RMRP funds.
So pre-April 1st? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, we were hoping that by this time, most tenants with pre-April 1st debt would have already been served. Those that have pre-April 1st debt need to apply quickly. And I say that because CDBG only allows for a certain number of months of assistance. And until we get additional money, once we shift to CDBG, the number of months will be restricted by, well, it's 6 months. So if there's housing trust fund dollars available, we would be able to consider covering pre-April 1st debt. But, you know, the money runs quickly. Eric, did you want to?
Well, I was only going to add the like you said, Pam, just to apply and the April 1st, as I recall, people would be able to go into a payment plan for some of that. You know, we can pay with the CRF through CRF. Federal CARES is the one that has the rule that we can't pay before April 1st. So I think the way we've been handling that is that we can pay up through then, and then the pre-debt can go into a payment plan. And am I right about that, Pam?
Yes, you're right, exactly. I should have mentioned that the CRF funds did have that caveat that it was basically pre the health emergency. So April 1st forward is the time period. But we have more flexibility with the Housing Trust Fund and less with CDBG.
All right, well, thank you so much. We are out of time, and thank you all again for all of your leadership and all of the work you've put in over the past year. I know it's been particularly challenging. And I'm going to turn it over to Bree, who will give us a few logistical updates, and we'll see you all throughout the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Eric, Willie, and Pam. You gave us a lot of information to digest. I just wanted to come on to let you all know that today will be a little bit different. Yesterday, there was just one track of sessions. We're going to take a short break after this session, and then at 11:45, we will come back. And at 11:45, you have two sessions that you can choose to attend from. Securing the land through unique partnerships, and the other track is making it work. So in your agenda, you will see two sessions at the same time. You can either flip back and forth, or you can just stay on one session. And that's how the rest of the sessions will be today. We will just remind you, and there are breaks built in between all of the sessions today. So you have a little more time to get up, stretch, grab a snack, use the bathroom, whatever you need to do. Another reminder, please don't forget to visit the exhibit hall. There is another challenge going on today. It was brought to my attention that there were maybe 2 codes that were missing yesterday, and we have fixed that. So please head over there and join the challenge for today. The points carry over, and Brian and I will announce the winner at the last sessions today. He'll be in one session, I'll be in another, but regardless, if the attendee is not in the session, we will still reach out to you to give you your prize. And so we'll go ahead and break now. And like I said, if you have any questions throughout the conference today, feel free to email us at hcc2020@vahousingalliance.org. I know some people asked for these slides from the session, and I have uploaded them to your actual agenda so you can get them from there, but we will also send out all these materials for you all after the conference. So if you can go ahead and take a break, and we'll see you all in the breakout sessions at 11:45.